This one. Oh. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Well, we have an all-star cast here to discuss the future of the Middle East. And I want to... Sorry, my microphone is cutting off. I wanted to start with Ali Vaez. Ali, so obviously the president of Iran was killed in a crash yesterday. What next for Iran?
Thank you very much, Peter. Let me start by thanking the Sufan Group for inviting me. It's great to be here. You know, the impact of presidential transitions in Iran, Peter, whether they're they happen in normal circumstances or they're sudden, as it happened last night, are often either overestimated or downplayed. Because at the end of the day, the president does not have a definitive say over Iran's regional policy or foreign policy. He doesn't have full control over the military, or even the power of the purse is quite limited. But he's also not irrelevant. His foreign minister often sets the tone for the country's foreign policy, and so it does matter who is in charge of the government. They inform the supreme leader, they can influence policy, but at the end of the day, the ultimate decision maker, which is the supreme leader, the ultimate actor in the region, which is the Revolutionary Guards, they are going to remain in place. And so I expect on those fronts much more continuity than change. Where there is going to be a high degree of uncertainty, I think, is over the succession process in Iran. The supreme leader is 85 years old. President Raisi was seen as a protege of the supreme leader, as a potential successor. And his removal from the stage is going to definitely create a jockeying for what comes next and who would be in the run-up for that critical post. There's also another element here that, as someone who is in the business of conflict prevention, worries me, which is that in the next 50 days, Iran will be focused internally on organizing an election to elect a successor to President Raisi. Now, this is, just to use an American analogy, this is like the primaries in the US. This is not really an open election. This is an election within the conservative camp. It is even easy to predict that the next president would be someone with the profile of President Raisi, so pretty loyal to the establishment. Raisi even, I would say, set a new standard for the degree of subservience from the executive branch towards the deep state represented by the supreme leader and the Revolutionary Guards. But because it would be internally focused, adversaries in the region might see in that period an opportunity, and they might push the envelope. And here what is particularly concerning is the fact that after the last month's back and forth between Iran and Israel, I think the old rules of the game are out and the new rules are not yet fully established. And so all that has happened in the past 24 hours is adding uncertainty to the ambiguity that existed already between Iran and Israel, which I think increases the risk of miscalculations. There are other implications as well, but let me leave it at that and come back to it later.
Mina, Al-Oraibi, do you agree with that, and do you have anything to add to that?
I agree with Ali's assessment, particularly the issue of uncertainty. This is already a very, very difficult time in the region, and now you have a moment of uncertainty, and as Ali rightly highlighted, there is going to be an internal dynamic at the moment in Tehran that maybe Israel will seek to capitalize on and up the ante, especially as we don't see any clear end to the devastating war in Gaza. So there's that concern. Also, the foreign minister, and we're focusing on the president rightly so, but the foreign minister was a key player. Abdullahian was known, especially in the Arab world, quite well, speaks Arabic. So that dynamic also, who becomes the foreign minister and what will their inclination be, rightly so strategically where Iran sits, will not change dramatically, not expected to, but this will have implications for sure. And I think there's a sense that it is a tragedy, a shock to the system that was not on the cards given all the other uncertainty.
Elisabeth, can you reflect what, if anything, this development means for the Houthis in Yemen? Are the Houthis deterrable? To what extent? I mean, there was a longer debate about the extent of what... Are they a proxy force of Iran in the sense of Hezbollah, or are they something very different? And they seem to be continuing taking these pot shots at commercial shipping in the Red Sea, despite quite a lot of US and UK activity against some Houthi targets. So give us an overall assessment of where the Houthis are, what their thinking is.
Thanks. So, are the Houthis deterrable, and will this make a difference? Of course, the Houthis rely on Iran for their weapons, for their training, and for other support. But they now have their own dynamic and their own propulsion. So I don't think it would be a game changer, at least not in the short term, even if Iran were to pull support. The Houthi leader, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, and his spokesperson have both started to talk of their movement as bolder than Iran. Now, sure, it would make a difference if the weapons stopped coming, but it wouldn't make an immediate difference. They have stockpiles, and of course, it's a very asymmetric war, what they're doing, at least in the Red Sea. The kinds of material that they're launching into the Red Sea, it doesn't have to be accurate, it just needs to keep going in order to have an impact and to disrupt markets and shipping. So are they deterrable? I think we've seen after 200 missiles at Israel, over 100 ships attacked, that the airstrikes by the United States and the United Kingdom are not working yet. And they might degrade them a little bit, but what the Houthis have is exceptional propaganda. We could certainly do quite a bit more to untangle their propaganda apparatus. What we also could do, which is linked to that, is to implement some kind of ceasefire in Gaza. That's not to say I'm taking the Houthis at their word, but they probably would have to stage some kind of tactical halt to their strikes. So at least it would take away their propaganda if they were then to continue. They would find themselves on the back foot. So are they deterrable? Not really. I think it's going to take much, much more. Will what's happening in Iran at the moment, any kind of instability, even if Iran were to change tactics, deter them? No.
Just one follow-up there. They obviously survived something like 20,000 bombing raids by the Saudis, which killed something like 30,000 Yemenis, a good number of them civilians. If you can survive 8 years of an air war, which ultimately the Saudis stopped because they more or less lost the war, or they decided this wasn't worth the effort involved. So obviously US and UK airstrikes are going to be much more pinpoint than the Saudi airstrikes, which were not pretty indiscriminate. But what does that record of resistance to the Saudis suggest about their ability to survive US and UK continued airstrikes?
Well, I think there are a couple of things here. Yes, you're right. The Houthis managed to sustain over 25,000 airstrikes by the Saudi-led coalition in at least 7 of the last 9 years of the civil war. It didn't deter them, and they've become very adaptable indeed. But also, what we're doing currently with our airstrikes plays into their hands. It actually emboldens them, it strengthens them, because it it feeds into their narratives, well, not just Houthi narratives, but narratives by other global players, China, Iran, Russia, of the US and the UK as kind of world police. And on the ground in Yemen and across the region, I think the Houthis have found that their stance has worked for them. It's increased their popularity. Now, this might not continue through the long term, but certainly in the short term, it's worked to their advantage, and they have developed strategies over the past 9 years of the war to withstand pinpointed strikes. I don't think that any kind of ground offensive against the Houthis is possible, certainly not by external forces in an election year and given the bandwidth issues with other world crises.
Ronan, congratulations also on your brilliant piece with Mark Mazzetti, who's also here, which is, I think, probably the most important piece about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has been written, which is in yesterday's New York Times. And I want to briefly summarize what I think the main points are. A, there's been a long record of Israeli violence against settler violence against Palestinians. B, a lot of people got away with it. And C, those people have co-opted the government. And so, I was very surprised by the fact that the defense minister publicly criticized Prime Minister Netanyahu for his lack of a real day-after plan. I can't think of a war in history where the defense minister publicly criticizes the head of state about a lack of a plan. It's a basic principle of military success that you have unity of command and agreement on strategy. So I'm trying to connect those two ideas. A, you have this settler movement that has sort of effectively co-opted the government. B, you have this public dispute between Gallant and Netanyahu. How does that all sort of fit together?
Right. Thank you so much. After these warm words, I think that the best thing I can do is walk away. It's all connected, of course. And I think what we saw from Minister of Defense Gallant for the second time, recalling exactly a year ago when this was during the so-called judicial overhaul, the attempt to turn Israel by the Netanyahu government into a kind of a half dictatorship, half kleptocracy, ruled by those people while destroying the Supreme Court and other mechanism of monitoring of the law and enforcing of the law, obeying the law. And Minister Gallant came to the press back then and said, we are under grave threat to national security. Our foes, our enemies see this as an opportunity. He basically is doing the same. And and just remind everybody, then he was fired by the Prime Minister, erupting the strongest wave of protest, basically forcing the Prime Minister to take him back. He doesn't like him. He didn't like him ever since. And their relationship deteriorated to the point of his second speech just days ago. He is very close to the defense establishment. He comes from there. He was chief of the Navy SEALs and then the commander of the Southern Front. And I think he speaks for them. It's not just this unprecedented event that the Minister of Defense is standing against the head of state. It's the whole of the military, the whole of the defense establishment. And you need to be, I don't want to use any derogatory terms, of course, not about my country, but you need to be a very unique country where the defense establishment is guarding democracy against the political level. And we see this throughout the last year and a half since this government was introduced, that it's the intelligence community and the military who are always on the guards to make sure that this next horrible thing would not happen. And the next horrible thing now is what started to be unmasked, is what Netanyahu is really planning. He was not avoiding a day after strategy because he didn't have one, as everybody thought. He had one, and that one is to completely adopt what the ultra-right radicals in his government, the ultra-nationalist Ben Gvir and the radical Smotrich, the Minister of National Security, and the Minister of Treasury, who is also a minister in the Ministry of Defense. And as you quoted our story, Mark Mazzetti and myself, together with our colleague Nathan Odenheimer, the lawless have become the law. And they are now controlling the government. Netanyahu is basically going through and trying to implement military law on Gaza, contradicting any promise, any commitment that he himself has given that Israel doesn't want to rule Gaza. But behind that, there is a secret agenda. And this is an ultra-nationalist, ultra-religious, extreme fundamentalist agenda to reinstate the settlements that were disassembled by Prime Minister Ariel Sharon in 2005 during the disengagement. It's basically to enforce the law on Gaza, to enforce the Israeli law on Gaza, to annex Gaza. And let me just recall one, I think, something that could explain, because people will say, but why is Netanyahu doing all that? Doesn't he understand? He does. He does. He's a very, very smart person. Detached, but he's smart. There's a famous Israeli columnist, maybe the most important one in Israel, called Nahum Barnea, writing a weekly column in Yediot. He once said about Netanyahu, he said, for politicians, they usually have themselves at the center and everything else in the background. For Netanyahu, he said, there's no background. And this explains, I think, everything. He is concerned with the integrity of his coalition, and that's it. Nothing else matters. And because he is coerced by those ultra-nationalists, this is a coalition government, you need to get their votes, because nobody else wants to sit in this coalition because he's under trial for bribery and corruption, then he is just very strict with following everything they tell him to do.
Colonel Koskinas, you're a retired U.S. Air Force officer and with a lot of experience in special operations. And the New York Times has done a very good job about reporting about the scale of the bombing in Gaza using satellite imagery and other sort of techniques. It is clear that 2,000-pound bombs are being used. I mean, just for people, I'm not a professional military guy, but a 500-pound bomb would be kind of the standard. So why are the Israelis, to the extent that you can determine, using 2,000 bombs, which obviously in a very built-up urban environment have pretty large impacts? And I know you're not a lawyer, but I want you to think about, from your own career, obviously you had many experiences where you had a JAG, which is a U.S. military lawyer in the room, sort of telling you what you could and couldn't do. And how would you assess what the Israelis have been doing in Gaza based on your own experience of what an American military lawyer would have been advising you?
Well, Peter, thank you for giving me the easiest question. Right up front, I would say that it's interesting to consider this question as somebody who is not focused on Israel as much as, perhaps my colleague here. But from a military perspective, I would tell you that weaponeering is definitely more science than art, although there is an art to it. I think that depending on each target that you're looking at, you consider what is the weapon that you want to have in terms of the effects that you want to have. And I would venture to say that Gaza was probably one of the most difficult environments to consider bombing, with the density. It's a very obviously densely populated area, and the tunnel system that's underneath there is a very challenging weaponeering problem, especially when you consider that there is an invasion that's coming behind whatever the air power influence is going to be or effects. And so there's almost an attempt to degrade the enemy to the point that it keeps casualties down on your own side of the military that's going in. Now, having said that, at least, and again, New York Times has done quite a nice review of, I believe you listed, at least in the beginning of the fight in October, over 90% of the munitions dropped were either 1,000 or 2,000 pound bombs, with a 10% being 250 pound, what they call the small diameter bombs, or some variety of it, but certainly lesser. I think, not to take it too deep and nerd out on the weaponeering, but I will say that when you're trying to reach those tunnels, you have to use larger munitions, but there's also something else that's involved, which is the fusing that you have to use in order for a bomb to go through basically the top of the roof of a building and actually detonate subterranean in order to cause, that tunnel to explode. So in some ways, everybody thinks 2,000 pound bomb, it's a much, wider destruction bomb, but if you have certain fusing for it, it's going to, it drops the building. Let's just say that that's a damage that is not going to be undone, but it's not intended to cause this wider, kind of destruction. And also, the deeper it goes, again, not to nerd out, it's a different kind of bomb that requires a much more hardened shell, steel shell. So it even has less explosives because of the weight distribution of the shell versus this. All that to say that they've chosen to go down the heavy destruction mode rather than anything else. I don't know if that covers it.
Mina, Al-Oraibi, you're originally Iraqi and you're a British citizen as well. So Prime Minister Soudani was here, as you know, he was in DC on April 15th. There seems, obviously there's very healthy debate about the continued presence of US troops in Iraq, which number about 2,500. We all know what happened the last time the US pulled out of Iraq, a deal negotiated by Vice President Biden and his National Security Advisor, Tony Blinken, which is 3 years later, ISIS was marching on the gates of Baghdad. And all Iraqis know this background. However, of course, the Iranians have great influence of the political parties in Iraq and also in the military. So do you think that they will come up with some sort of face-saving thing? Well, A, they'll wait for see if Trump is elected and see what that could change. Or B, they'll set up a commission that will just look into the problem and come up with really no solution, which seems like the likely answer. So what do you think is what is the mood in Iraq about the US presence? And do you think it is possible that there may be an agreement to pull out?
So Prime Minister Soudani and his delegation really made a point to try to avoid making this the question of the entire visit. For him, it was really important to be seen as a trusted partner by the Americans, and also that Iraq is moving forward beyond the time of the invasion and actually is healthy again as a state. Many people would question that given some of the dynamics in the country. So we moved past the visit. Now, post-visit, there is a sense of it's no longer on the front burner of the political debate in Iraq. There's still no head of parliament. Unfortunately, we just had the parliamentary session that was meant to choose the head of parliament descending into a fist fight. So the political dynamic in the country at the moment is very much focused on what's happening internally. But part of the axis of resistance movement that again is being fueled by the continued war in Gaza, this topic always comes up. So in a way, again, all these issues in the region need an end to the bombing on Gaza and to see some sort of track that takes away the propaganda tools like the Houthis use and also the axis of resistance parties inside of Iraq that say the Americans have to go out because they're supporting Israel. I think it changes the dynamic if we can get an end to the war. However, there's also, of course, the impeding U.S. elections. That's on everyone's mind, and I'm impressed that it didn't come up till this moment, to really think about what does that mean for the dynamic in Iraq and other countries of the region. The Prime Minister is in a difficult position because, again, he is a coalition government and he has to make sure that he can keep his coalition together. So there is internal pressure on him, but every indication is he'd rather not push the envelope on actually ending the troop presence for the time being to see where it goes. on the street in Iraq, this isn't a big topic of debate because, like you said, there's only 2,500 American troops. They're not really on the streets; they're in their bases, and it's seen as this almost ability to say that Iraq is still within the orbit of American military interests, which always mean then there's more political interest. There's an idea that if the Americans pull out militarily, then Iraq is even further down the priority list for American decision makers.
And Colonel Koskinas, you focus a lot of your work on Iraq. Is that basically your assessment?
It is. It is. I mean, you've done a masterful job. The only thing I would add is that when Iraq voted in October 2021, there was a lot of uncertainty, obviously, about what was going to come out of the results. And when the Solders pulled out, there was even more, uncertainty about what was going to happen, and almost a far more, a deeper concern about the new government that came into being in October 2022, because, again, as you mentioned, all the different parties that are involved may, almost give the hint that this is going to be a bit of an anti-American thing. I think Prime Minister al-Sudani has done a masterful job of balancing between different entities within his government, and it's clear from his April visit, and quite frankly, it's clear also from what's happened since October with a lot of fighting and weapons dropped on U.S. bases, and that has stopped since February. So his visit to the U.S., I think, was more focused on let's move on to a different kind of relationship that's not based on a counter-ISIS only campaign. It's not based on just, countering Iran in some, Iraq is important in of itself, both domestically, in its space, but also in the region. So I think that that's come across, and I think it was well received in the U.S. So for what that's worth, I think.
Yeah, so I'm taking from both of what you said that U.S. troops will probably remain in Iraq for the foreseeable future. Is that correct?
I mean, it's really hard to tell what will happen on the wider regional dynamic, because this particular debate isn't about what American troop presence in Iraq means. It may have been 5-10 years ago when it was seen as an occupying power. That is no longer the perception, but it is much more about what America's position in the region is, especially given the dynamics of what's happening in Palestine. So I think we can't say for sure this won't flare up again, and you don't know why. You're right, we've done a lot of reporting on the issue of the fact that American troops are not under direct attack, and these are Iraqi bases where American troops are. Currently there is unspoken truce, but that could at any moment disappear. It's a fragile truce.
Again, I mean, masterful description, but the one thing I would add is that from a U.S. interest perspective, I would highly recommend that there is a consideration for security cooperation between Iraq and the U.S. I think that there's probably going to be a much smaller footprint and cooperation at a much less tactical level. I think it also has to do with what kind of munitions, what kind of weapons does Iraq want to have, what kind of direction they want to take. Also, U.S. companies are likely going to feel more comfortable seeing how the governance goes, anti-corruption, but also, some kind of a U.S. presence that's fairly robust, but far lower than where we are right now. So definitely something to consider.
So Ali, Mina and Gianni both alluded to this, which is come after the attacks against the U.S. service members in Jordan in January, the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and Syria have basically stopped their attacks on U.S. bases. And so, I mean, A, why did that happen? B, then this is a big question, what does Iran want right now? What is its actual goals? And C, one thing that is pretty clear is no one is completely sure of their red lines. I mean, a big red line was crossed when Iran, sent 300 various projectiles in the direction of Israel. The red lines keep sort of shifting, and the problem is if people don't really know where they are, it can easily cause, it can escalate the conflict.
That's absolutely right. Look, I think there is a short game here and a long game. The short game for Iran was to impose a cost on what was happening in Gaza, and also deter Israel from what it saw as potential strategic plan that Israel had in mind of going after members of axis of resistance one by one in a sequential manner. But it did not want a full-scale regional war. It did not want uncontrolled escalation, and that's why when some of these groups in Iraq pushed the envelope too far, Iran pulled them back in. And my understanding is that it was also a favor to Prime Minister Soudani that is very much liked at the top of the Iranian leadership, and they didn't want to do anything that would jeopardize his trip to Washington as well. But there are other members of the axis of resistance, like the Houthis, who are carrying on that job of trying to put pressure on Israel and the United States and the West writ large. And so I don't think the Iranians saw what was happening in Iraq and Syria as too critical to lose, at least in the short run. But in the long run, it's a different calculation. And I think what happened with Israel, the flare-up last month, is going to have an impact on the Iranian calculus, in the sense that, we always thought that the first line of defense against Israel for Iran was in Lebanon. But what Israel did with its very limited retaliation against Iran on April 18th, from what we know, apparently Israel came pretty close to the Iranian border and fired air-to-land ballistic missiles from the Iraqi airspace. That means Iraq is the first line of defense for Iran. And Iran can't really do anything about closing up the Iraqi airspace to Israeli fighter jets until and unless the US is out. So I think there is renewed motivation on the Iranian side to try to push the US out. Now, they know, they're a good reader of American politics, and they understand that it's very unlikely that this would happen in an election year. This would be yet another demonstration of weakness by the Biden administration in the eyes of its critics in the face of aggressive Iranians. But once the election is done, I think we are very likely to see renewed attacks on US forces, with the ultimate objective again being to do a redux of 2011 and push the US out of Iraq and Syria.
Elisabeth, two questions, one unrelated to each other, but one is, the Houthis won the war, right? They have the populous north, they have the capital, and they have the most important port. There's no possibility of them being dislodged from this position.
Well, the Houthis won the war. You said it. Yes, it does. It does look like that. It certainly looks like that to the Houthis. And that's quite important, because we have to think about the logic that they themselves are thinking. To them, they won the war. They got all the concessions from the truce, even without continuing the sign up to the truce. They feel very confident. They're not afraid of the United States. They've seen what happened to the United States in Afghanistan. They've seen what happened, or what is happening in Iraq. So they're feeling on top of the world. And they also think they've got God on their side. And we mustn't underestimate that as a powerful driver. But what's important here is that this could mean that the UN roadmap is properly dead in the water. Now, that was still being talked up by the long-suffering envoy Grundberg back in December, but they're sounding much less positive now. And the reason for that is that how can you have a power-sharing agreement that leaves the Houthis in their current form in charge of an area of the Red Sea coast? That no longer seems such a palatable option. And the Saudi-Houthi talks, well, if the Saudis and the Houthis do manage to come to some kind of agreement and Saudi withdraws, it looks very much like a protectionist racket. It looks really like the Saudis are paying the Houthis to leave them alone and to give them an elegant exit for the war. That doesn't look at all good for the Presidential Leadership Council that's left behind in Yemen. But many good reasons for Saudi to do so: Vision 2030, NEOM, Red Sea tourism, etc., etc. And also, if you were a country that might, in the near-term future, start relying on desalination plants, you wouldn't really want the Houthis with all their drones and missiles as your enemy.
You run you're the president of an important college at Cambridge University, and I'm just curious about how the British and Europeans in general are sort of beginning to hedge for what looks like an almost certain Trump victory were it to happen tomorrow, and kind of what does that mean for the Middle East in general? Obviously, when Trump was in power the last time, he kept trying to pull American troops out of Syria, and he was sort of blocked by people who slow-rolled those things. And he, obviously, you mentioned the Afghan withdrawal. Obviously, it was kind of his plan that Biden went through with. So what is the kind of mood in Europe about this potential Trump victory? And how does it affect how people will operate in the Middle East, given the fact that A, can be somewhat quixotic, I guess is a kind of polite way of putting it, and B, he does have a record of his basic point is we should just get out of all these places.
Oh, this is going to be a really tricky one to answer diplomatically. I can't speak for Europe now because, of course, since 2016, we're no longer in it. But I'd say that we have a much bigger question on our hands in the UK now. Everyone's worried about Trump, but we're even more worried about ourselves and what's happening inside the UK. We've had a fairly chaotic few years. We don't have the same ripple effect on the world stage anymore as America does, of course, but it has a very dramatic ripple effect inside the UK itself. We can't keep following the US if Trump gets in. But right now, I think all of our focus is on what on earth is going to happen with our general election at the end of the year. I should just add that, if someone had said 5 years ago that David Cameron was going to come back in as Foreign Secretary, we'd have all just thought that was a shambles and an absolute disaster. But following what we've just had, perhaps we could skip an era, go back to Liz Truss and then also to Boris Johnson as our foreign secretaries. This is actually looking quite positive.
Rona, I wanted to return to you on Israel. And you mentioned, so what is the view amongst ordinary Israelis about the conduct of the war? They may not like Bibi. And how do they feel misunderstood by the rest of the world? How do they see the world's reaction to what they're doing as sort of wrong, misplaced, or whatever adjective you want to use?
Yeah. I think that, first of all, many Israelis totally fail to understand the world in its criticism against Israel. One of the reasons is that much of the Israeli media do not fully reflect what is happening in Gaza. And as in the, 130 years of historical war and dispute and clash between Israelis and Palestinians, between Jews and Arabs in this haunted region, they are preoccupied with their own miseries and their own suffering. And the Gazans as well, and of course it leaves very narrow bandwidth to think about the other side's miseries. But I would say that in a way, as much as the Israelis fail to understand the world fails to understand the Israelis. When the Israelis here, and it is not judging the Israelis or saying that they are right or wrong, I'm just trying to reflect, maybe better reflect how things are looked from that side. When the world is seeing this discussions over the size of a bomb. Now, the Israelis, they would say, what would you do? What the US government or Her Majesty's government, if they would know that one of the masterminds behind the attack on October 7th sits at -3 level, 40 meters underground, controlling a command post, and there's only one bomb that can take him and the whole command tunnel out. And Israel believes it did everything it can to ask or demand or order the civilians out. Now the Israelis are coming and saying, well, we have done, because lawyers told them to say so, so the Israeli spokespeople are saying, we have done everything we can to prevent collateral damage. Now, of course, once you know that there are civilians up above ground and you decide to bomb, then you did not do everything you can, because, of course, to do everything you can means not to bomb, but it still leaves a question that I think is not frequently asked: what would you do following that attack? And maybe another example was a high representative of the United Nations speaking on this podium just 2 hours ago. From the Israeli point of view, or for many Israelis, I'm not talking about the Israeli government. I'm trying to reflect Israelis, the majority, who are opposing the government and are opposing parts of that war. And I'm sure this will be shown in the next election. But before that, for many Israelis, if someone understands the Israeli government or how the Israeli government believes it promotes Israeli national security, I'm happy if he calls me and explains that to me. But I'm talking about the majority of the public, including the parts of the military. When they hear a high representative of the United Nations standing on this stage, talking about the suffering, with all good reason, of the Gazans, and the destruction of Gaza, and I have been, I don't know how many people in this audience have been in Gaza since the beginning of the war. I have been there many times, but I've also been, since the first day, in the villages and the kibbutzim and other areas around across the border in Israel. And when he speaks about the suffering of Gaza, and he says nothing about the death in Israel, the attack that started all of that, and the hundreds of thousands of people that had to be mislocated, refugees in their country, and he says nothing, he will lose any attention from the Israelis, because they would think that he's not someone that can be negotiated with. And I think this is where those two sides, the world and many of the Israelis, come to a sort of a non-starter.
Can I ask you, I'm going to ask you and Gianni the same question, which is, there's been a lot of discussion of autonomous weapons and the use of AI in warfare. And there seemed to be some very good reporting by 972 about the way the Israelis are using artificial intelligence to select targets. And I believe the code name of the operation is Lavender, and there may be another name as well. So and what's very interesting about this is when you usually in Washington, when you have a discussion of AI and warfare, it's usually about the Chinese. Well, it turns out it's the Ukrainians who are using AI-guided autonomous weapons, who are our allies, and also Israel that is using AI autonomous weapons, who are our allies of the United States. So, to what extent do you think that this reporting is accurate, Ronan? And then I'll ask Gianni a separate question related.
Peter, sometimes people come to me and offer sources and stories, and I think about the stories that they are too bad to be true. That they sound more like a Netflix episode than something that happens in reality. Did I say anything wrong? Because I was... No.
So the story is too good to be true.
But I think, so let me, the Israeli intelligence is using AI. And by the way, with some top secret Palestinian Hamas documents from Amn al-Am, the General Security Service of Hamas, the Hamas Stasi, It turns out that Hamas is using them, that Adam Rascon, my colleague in the New York Times, and myself just published. Turns out the Hamas are using them for other targets as well. I think that the problem with researching and investigating the Israeli rules of conduct is lying somewhere else. I'll go back to this in a minute. Somewhere, I think that the attempt to describe as if there is a computer somewhere who chooses targets, and the computer is finalizing the targets, and the computer is sending the choppers or the drones or the helicopters or the fighting aircraft. I think that's wrong. I think that they are someone. Compare that with someone who is sitting in some kind of a cable network service network point and giving service to people that have malfunctions, and then the AI get the information much easier. At the end of the day, the question is not why an AI chose wrong, or not why the Israelis have given that to an AI. I think this is too much. Then I'm not sure it happened. What I do believe is that there needs to be a thorough research and a thorough look into how the Israelis chose their targets and what kind of supervision, oversight were put before the war and immediately after the war started. Just to give one example and not to be vague. Facing petitions at the Supreme Court by human rights organizations in years before the war, the Israeli administration has said, the Israeli Defense Department, we are using a procedure called knock on the roof, which basically said if Israel was planning to strike a building, they were calling the civilians in that building. They said, you have 15 minutes to evacuate. You are sitting on a Hamas secret stash of weapons. Go. And then bombing that building. The Israelis said in some statements that they stopped using that protocol after the beginning of the war. Was there another protocol instated? Was it something that the Israelis did in addition? Does that, without the protocol following the rules, the legal rules of conduct? And I think those are the main questions. And even from the point of view of, I would say, the ego of the intelligence officials, I would be hesitant that they gave that to a computer.
If I can deconstruct some of this just real quick, because you mentioned something that is really important, which I'm sure in Israel people are saying, what would you do? As you mentioned, rather than take down the AI problems, which I admittedly I'm not super well qualified on. I'll take that on for a second. Look, on Facebook, on Twitter, X platform, LinkedIn, there are so many experts on just about everything you want to hear, and I'm sure that they would say, of course we would do something, different or something else. I would just pose certain things because I'm not walking a mile in your shoes. I don't have access to classified information. I don't know exactly what they're seeing. But when you have the question, if there is a senior Hamas leader at level 3, my question is, where are the hostages? Are they at level 4? And so, without knowing what is actually in that building, your lawyer and the commander ultimately makes a decision that says that is the acceptable, or, it raises to a particular level that they make a decision that is an acceptable casualty determination. What I will say, to answer very specifically to your point, I have said, no, we're not dropping. I have recommended that this is far too much casualties for the bang that you want and for the target that you have. And, in my experience, I've never been overruled on that, but and the commanders have made that decision. So, what would you do? Maybe something different is the answer from me. The last thing on it is, look, you could look at other places around the Middle East. You can go to Aleppo and you can see destruction. You can go to different places around the world and you can see destruction. You have not seen the U.S. carpet bomb Kabul in order to get, bin Laden. So I think it's a counterfactual argument if you want to go down that lane, or maybe not counterfactual, but you can definitely get off, the wrong exit if you start going down the path of trying to mirror image that.
Yeah. Switching gears a bit, Mina, you live in Abu Dhabi. Of course, the Abraham Accords were sort of, I think, had a fatal flaw in them, which was they were conducted with, there was, Jared Kushner was going to have this big conference, and there was going to be $50 billion that was going to come into the Gaza and the West Bank, and Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, said one of the greatest sort of stupid lines of all time at this conference where no one paid any money. He said West Bank and Gaza are going to be a hot IPO, meaning they're going to be a hot kind of investment. Anyway, so none of that happened. The Abraham Accords seemed to me fundamentally flawed because they basically were negotiated above the heads of the Palestinians, and there was really nothing in it for them. So, UAE has not formally withdrawn diplomatic relations with Israel. However, we've seen a lot of very critical statements from the UAE. And so are the Abraham Accords sort of on life support? We have National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan visiting Saudi Arabia yesterday to speak to Crown Prince bin Salman. And clearly there's an element in the US government that basically thinks that's the magic answer, details to come. So what is the status of the Accords, and is there any plausible kind of deal where there would be an actual guarantee of a two-state solution embedded in the deal with Saudi Arabia?
Thanks, Peter. I mean, absolutely, the Abraham Accords, as are the peace deals with Jordan and Egypt, under the biggest stress they've ever been under. And it's the Arab countries that have decided to come to a deal with Israel, with all the differences between, of course, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Jordan, Egypt. None of them have decided to break relations because there's still the idea that Israel as a country is seen differently from the actions of the current government, but also what the future could look like. In terms of a deal, it's clear to everybody that it can't be the old formula of at the end of everything else being agreed, you can have a two-state solution. Everyone now is in agreement, you need to have a Palestinian state. And it was telling that there were only 8 countries that sided with Israel on this idea of Palestine becoming a full member of the UN. So I think for the UAE, as you said, they've not only been very critical, they've been working very hard, as have other countries, to try to convince the Israelis that this is in their better interest to stop dropping the size bombs, but also to find a political path. And now we're hearing from within their own war cabinet the same remarks, that this is not feasible. So I think there's a lot of frustration amongst Arab diplomatic circles for the countries that still have ties with the Israelis and are still speaking to the Israelis, including the mediation efforts of Qatar, which have been so important. But there's been a frustration that there hasn't been a will, as we heard earlier on the stage, to actually see a political solution. I think for the normalization deal with Saudi Arabia, that's got its own track. And, in September of last year, it almost seemed that this is it. The Israelis and the Saudis are going to agree, and it's all done. But actually, when you spoke to Israeli diplomats, you had a different kind of answer than you had from the Saudi diplomats. And we were speaking to a lot of the Saudi officials who were like, we're not in a rush to see this through. We need to make sure that the deal is right for us, but also for the Palestinians. And the Palestinian Authority was very much involved in that. And yet, it didn't seem that either the Americans or the Israelis were able to deliver on the Palestinian side of the deal. And we'll see if Jake Sullivan, in this trip or in future discussions, is able not only to deliver what a security deal for Saudi Arabia looks like, but also what a Palestinian state looks like. Then you can see some movement. But at the moment, I think there's a lot more being written and discussed about the end game for the Palestinians than we can actually see the Israelis implementing.
Ronan and also maybe Gianni, there's often a kind of view that if we get bin Laden, the problem's over. And maybe in bin Laden's case that was more true than others. But you think about Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in Iraq, who was killed in 2006. Al-Qaeda in Iraq went on to become ISIS. And so killing that one particular person wasn't a magic solution. So if Shinwar was to be killed, how is Hamas organized? I presume it has a military committee that consists of more than one person. Would that, be a psychological victory without any real impact, or what would it mean?
I'm sure that if Sinwar is killed, and he is the mastermind, without whom nothing of that would have been happening, because if we look at other opinions from the Shura of Hamas and from the exiled political leadership, I think that they were furious that he decided to end the conflict, to end the dispute. What is Hamas? Hamas, are they ruling a country? Are they a jihadist organization? He just failed to send the email to his partners that he just ended the discussion.
So meaning that he didn't consult with the Hamas political leadership, or meaning what?
He didn't tell anyone except a circle of 5 to 6, 7 max people with whom he met in person. One of the reasons to this historical epic intelligence blunder of Israel that will be put in books and movies and Netflix series in the same line like Pearl Harbor, the Yom Kippur War and others, the Barbarossa, as one of the biggest intelligence failures in history, was that Israelis were so dependent and confident that they can wiretap those exotic encrypted channels of communication, but nobody spoke in those channels. Whether because he just realized that he should not tell anyone, or maybe he knew that the Israelis are listening, but whatever happened, he was smart to understand that he needs to tell no one outside the Gaza Strip, even his deputy that he dispatched, Khalil Khaya, that he dispatched to outside, that he is outside of the strip during when it's that he didn't know. If he is killed, this will be seen, I'm sure that this will be exported by Israel as a victory. But I think that most Israelis, at least most of the leaders of the intelligence community and the defense establishment, after so many years of fighting Hamas and every time killing that one individual, assassinating Jabari or Marwan Issa or others, and thinking this will end the conflict, they are totally disenchanted. And they understand that Hamas cannot be destroyed. It's an idea that cannot be eradicated. And this is by far more important, and it goes back to your previous question about Gallant, they also understand that the only way to win this war is to ripe the military successes of the IDF into a political solution, that there will be nothing of a victory if this is not a political international solution agreed by everything. And they also understand that such a solution cannot come without the Palestinian Authority, which is exactly what Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to prevent.
Mina, you mentioned something which, if the Gaza conflict was dialed down, in a way, and there's a question for you, Ali, and also for you, Elisabeth, that the kind of rationale for the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea and the attacks for Iranian proxies, whether it's Hezbollah or others, sort of, does it just go away if the Gaza war goes away, or are there sort of deeper reasons why they might continue their actions, Elisabeth?
Well, there are deeper reasons why the Houthis might continue their actions. They've been, according to them at least, recruiting about 300,000 new fighters on the back of it. Even if it's a tenth of that, that's still worrying. The Houthis have always wanted an excuse to go after energy-rich areas of Yemen. Now, given that it looks like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates will have their tentacles into Hadramaut and Shabwa, that leaves Ma'rib. So I would expect the Houthis, irrespective of what happens in Gaza, to go east towards Ma'rib, give it another go, possibly push south towards the Bab al-Mandab as well. So I don't see any possibility of the Yemen civil war ending, or of the Houthis just getting with the UN roadmap without wanting further concessions.
I agree with that, but let me also add to what Mina said, that I remember when Jared Kushner put the deal of the century on the table, I was at a conference like this, and a senior Iranian official, having read some of the details, told me, this is great for us because there is nothing in it for the Palestinians. And in that sense, Iran's worst nightmare would be what Ronan talked about, which is to try to turn this military achievement on the ground into a political solution. Because Iran is, at the end of the day, is an opportunistic power. It really has a mastery of exploiting chaos, whether that's in Afghanistan or in Iraq or elsewhere. And the Palestinian cause, over the years, has allowed it to overcome inherent limitations to Iranian power as a Persian nation among Arabs and Turks, as a Shia nation among Sunnis. And so to deprive it from that card would significantly limit Iran's ability to project power beyond its borders. But there's also, we have to do this delicately, because if either because Israel starts a war with Hezbollah or because it deprives Iran of this oxygen that it needs to advance its regional policy, and Iran feels more vulnerable because its regional deterrence has been weakened, there is another option, unfortunately, available to it right now, which is its nuclear option. The country is closer to the verge of nuclear weapons than it has ever been. In 2018, when President Trump walked out of the Iran nuclear deal, it would take Iran 12 months to enrich enough uranium for a single nuclear weapon. That timeline, Peter, now is 6 days. And Iran have an arsenal worth of highly enriched nuclear material to 20% and 60%. So we have to act very carefully, but again, I couldn't agree more that the worst nightmare for the Iranians is actually a settlement of the Palestinian cause.
We have super limited time left, so Mina, if Iran got a nuclear weapon, would UAE and the KSA essentially basically, presumably Saudis could get technology from Pakistan, etc. I mean, would we have multiple nuclear armed states?
I'll answer that, but first I just want to change your framing of the previous question when you said, Mina, you said if the Gaza war ends, then the Houthis would lay down arms. It wasn't that much of a leap, but it was as long as the war continues, and as long as we have the Palestinians under attack in the way that they are, then those that want to claim that role of defending them would find it very difficult to go in any other negotiation. So I think, October 6th, this region wasn't in a great space, but it is incredibly worse today. So I think for us to try to de-escalate, that is a starting point that is essential for everything else to be considered. Nuclear arms. Look, the UAE has spoken at length, not only publicly but also privately, that they're very serious that the Baraka nuclear plant that they now have operational is a civilian one. They have gotten the highest possible ratings from the IAEA and have had them involved from day one to make sure that it is civilian, and this is part of a very serious effort for the energy transition that the country is going through. So I would absolutely rule it out that they would do it, given all the current dynamics. We can never tell what happens in 5-10 years. And I think for Saudi Arabia is a different dynamic, and the role they see for themselves in the region as a heavyweight in the region is different. But again, everything they have said is that they wouldn't. And part of their push for the defense agreement with the United States is to be able to say that actually we have this absolutely watertight deal with the Americans that they would find as a counterweight to possibly a nuclear Iran.
Ronan, it's hard. Obviously, this is a very hard question to answer. But I mean, if there's going to be a ceasefire, the hostages have to be released. And obviously, there's a constituency in Israel that's very vocal about the hostage releases. And then there seems to be a lot of reluctance by the Netanyahu government for a variety of reasons. Not sure how many people are dead or alive. And I think they're aware that Hamas has one big card, which they're not going to. I think they're going to dole that out pretty slowly. What is what's your view about where this negotiation is? And if there was a real hostage release with a real prisoner release on the other side, would that be a confidence-building measure to kind of something? Because, there seems to be no plan for the day after, but at least if that ceasefire held for a bit, then even the act of starting to rebuild Gaza would be a bit of a confidence-building measure.
So first of all, there are people in the audience here who are taking senior roles in the Qatari defense and intelligence establishment who will be, if they volunteer to take my seat and could answer this about the situation of the negotiations. But I think the situation today is not the best. I think the Egyptians sort of took the lead after a month that the negotiations was done mainly from here and by Qatar. They promised to deliver, and that depends on who you ask, but that didn't happen. And so the negotiation is in a dire state. And then it's stuck on the point of Hamas insistence. I see the red digits here, I understand. The Hamas is insisting that the first so-called humanitarian stage will start with saying that the release of the humanitarians is about Israeli civilians and the 5 women soldiers. But that it will start when saying that the second stage, the exchange for the Israeli military soldiers, men soldiers, will end with a total ceasefire and total withdrawal of the Israeli forces in Gaza. This Israel does not accept. This will probably cause the disassemblement of Netanyahu's coalition, going back to what I said before. And that still doesn't have a majority in the Israeli public. I think that is the point. This is where it's stuck, and it needs today very strong international pressure on both sides to find that tweaking, that some editing to that phrasing that would enable at least the humanitarian package, the release of probably 1,000, maybe more Palestinian prisoners in exchange of the Israeli civilians at the hands of Hamas. This could lead to a long ceasefire, and that, going back to the end of your question, that may lead to a solution that would finalize, would end this war, which doesn't even happening since mid-January from the Israeli military point of view, but of course the humanitarian crisis continues with no end. I am not sure that all of that can happen with current leadership at both sides.
Great. Well, we're out of time. I want to thank Ali, Elisabeth, Mina, Gianni, and Ronan. If you could all join in a round of applause.